Now we're live. Well,
Yay.
I don't know why, but it always takes like 5 seconds for it to actually start. I noticed on the recordings.
Ah,
So now we're actually live. And now everyone has seen our lovely disclaimer of just our own opinions and nobody else's,
nice.
But today's topic is CS degree or no degree. And I don't really know where to begin aside from, I guess, I don't have a degree and you have a degree. So we do have the two different perspectives here, that's for sure.
Nice.
Um,
I
why
thought you
don't
had a degree.
No, I went to Carleton University. I guess some context. First, okay, failed math class, so no high school diploma. Then, I don't know how this works, but a year later, I decided I'm going to apply to university anyways. And so they accept me. And I'm like, okay, logic, I don't know how that works. But anyways, they accept me. And I thought I was such a fraud. I was like, okay, the first day they're going to find out and then they're going to kick me out. No, I was able to go. It was a Bachelor of Arts undeclared. And because I had no idea what I wanted to do. And the short version is like my second or third week there, I'm like, nah, this is definitely not me. I had an intro to computer science class and I was like, nope. I had like, I don't know what else, intro to law, economics. And anyways, I went to the intro to law class and realized, man, this is just writing essays all the time. And I think it was like intro to macroeconomics or something. That was very interesting, but I'm like, lectures. So I dropped out. And the short version is I was at a meetup and someone got talking about a project they wanted to work on. They couldn't find a dev. I'm like, oh, I can write code. And then I interviewed and got a job at this little 50-person company. And that's how my development journey started. So there was no degree. Yours is probably very different from that story.
That is awesome. Wow. Okay. Yeah, my story is significantly different. I didn't have science or bio or any of those prerequisites in high school. Didn't think I needed them. Went to university and they were like, yeah, you need science to get into this faculty of science. I was like, crap. So convinced them that they would let me in on condition that I did what was called applied computer science. So you did first year math, no physics or anything like that, but you did psychology as the applied part. So I was like, okay, cool. I can do that. I want to do AI anyway. That's a good idea. Completely got obliterated by math class as well. It was just calculus and I did not get along. Went from doing reasonably well in high school to like 20% math. Like I'm going to be kicked out pretty quickly. Condition of them letting me in as well was they said, like, you're not meeting the minimum criteria because you don't have science. If you fail anything, you're out. I was like, wow, this is a problem. Got a tutor, scraped through my math class, like 51% sort of scraping through. Then once that was over, it kind of got easier. Did undergrad, got told that undergrad's fine, although like doing one more year, you get a like half postgrad. It's referred to as an honors degree. It'll let you stand out. So I did that. And then I was like, okay, well, now what? I don't know what to do. And friends of mine were like, are they going to do masters? I was like, okay, that sounds like a plausible plan.
At that point, just chilling. You're like, yeah, okay, masters.
Yeah, like let's go do that. Getting in. So my performance went better as I went through university. Like as the elective subjects sort of fell away and things like that, and it was just computer science, it went better and better. And then when masters rolled on, I was told, like, you basically don't pay for it. Essentially what happens is if you're passing your honors level and you're doing well enough, you just sort of tick a couple of boxes, and there's a whole bunch of companies that are providing bursaries and providing sort of, I guess you could call it like angel investment style bursaries where there's no strings attached. Just do it. There were a few that were like, sign on the dotted line and then we own you for 5 years, but I kind of dodged those. Then did what was meant to be a 2-year master's, and it took 4 years. So 7 years of college or 7 years of university later, I was asked if I wanted to update to PhD, and I was like, not a chance. I want nothing to do with this place. I am done. I ended up like my master's degree was pretty irrelevant. It was some wireless sensor network stuff, very unrelated to anything I do on my day job. And then I was like, I want to get the hell out, and I want a job. So then found a job, and I was done. So yeah, I went the very formal route that was kind of on tracks for me. Didn't have to do a lot of thinking, just execute the plan, and that was it.
So with that, like here, so I'm in Canada, and the university isn't as outrageous as some U.S. universities. I think my first year with books and tuition totaled, I think, $10,000, and I was a full-time student. Is that like kind of a similar situation where you were going, or is it very different? Because that's a big factor of this, of should you get a degree or not. It's like there are certain places, like there is a province where I live, school's 100% paid. So you could go there and it's covered. And then there's also the factor of like different, like the US, there's some schools where, it could be $50,000 like, I don't know, year or whatever. And it's like, oh man, so $200,000 for school versus me, it's like 40,000 to finish like a comp sci degree or something. So what was your situation?
Yeah, so education is significantly more affordable. It's heavily subsidized. Because if you're a foreigner and you study in South Africa, it's quite expensive. But if it's, well, nowhere near US tuition fees. But my per year tuition when I started was about $1,500, so about $1,500 around there. Books probably add another 100 or so around there, maybe a little bit more. But when you get to like postgrad level, you get very heavily subsidized. If you're doing a PhD, almost no one pays for it. I'm not aware of people actually ever really paying for it themselves. There's just a lot of sort of publish this by the state, thank these people who are paying for it, and off you go. So it's relative to people's income, it's not terrible. It's still pretty tough for some people, but it's getting easier with a lot of undergrad bursaries. So there is that. Unfortunately, we don't have any mechanisms like the US. I've spoken to people who joined various like the military of some wing or some division, and they ended up going to school through them. South Africa doesn't have that kind of option. So it's sort of student loan or bursary if you're performing very well, and depending on what you're choosing as well. So
is the student loan just through the government, or you have to get a private loan, or how's that work?
From what I understand, there are private loans which are very expensive, and then there are means of getting loans. It's kind of catch-22 because if you get it with your parents signing, you can get it at a more affordable rate. But then the irony is, like, if you can get it at a more affordable rate, you can probably afford it anyway. So it's a catch. But they're not as crazy high interest rates as the US. That's the other
because
thing.
Here it's just government loans.
Okay.
So I get direct from the government, and I think the interest is like, well, it fluctuates, but it's pretty competitive. It's like 1 or 2% above a mortgage. So like here right now would be, I think the average is 4.5%. So, and you pay nothing until you're left school. So there are no payments until I think it's like 6 or 12 months after you finished your courses, like you're totally done. So like if you stayed in school doing your bachelor's, and then you decide to go do your master's, you haven't made any payments on your student loan. It still accrues the interest on it, but you don't have to worry about making payments until you're actually fully done school.
That's pretty interesting. Like, I'm just thinking about it now. If you were in South Africa and you did an undergrad in computer science and you got a job, like just a relatively okay paying job, you should be able to pay off your student loan in about a year without too much issue. I would guess, assuming you didn't do something crazy and you finished on time. But I've also met people or know people who got crazy student loans for very, very obscure things and went out and got a degree, and they're like, oh, now I have to make money. I'm like, how? That's like you have some crazy understanding of some nuanced area of like Russian literature from some tiny time frame. Like, what are you going to do?
So,
Yeah.
so I guess my question for you is, do it again, degree or not?
No masters. It was a waste of time.
But you
It
still
was,
would do your bachelor's.
yeah. I would do my bachelor's and my honors degree, so the 4-year degree. My master's degree was, it took a lot of time. And if I had taken that time and focused it on getting into a dev job earlier on and executing there well, I think it would have been more beneficial. The only thing a master's taught me to do, what it's meant to do, is teach you how to take a really big problem and break it down, because it's not a coursework master's, it's purely dissertation and thesis.
Yep.
It's kind of like a mini PhD. You find a big topic, you write it up,
Yep.
you do the proof of concept and everything else. It teaches you how to be a little bit more rigorous in your like scientific method. But beyond that, I don't think it added much value to my professional career at all.
Now, do you
I don't
think
so.
like the bachelor's is just because of where you were? Like, if you had already been in the U.S. and didn't need to move, and you could have just went to the Bay Area, do you still think you would go for the bachelor's or not? Or, because that's usually a lot of scenarios. It's like, I don't have a degree, but my plan was never to go to the Bay Area. And I'm happy living in Canada. Like I have plenty of friends and coworkers who have gone and gotten degrees because of the easier path of immigrating somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's definitely, obviously, like that's much more valuable than the no degree spot, because the no degree spot like is going to be so much harder to get in.
For sure. Yeah, I think the university I attended, at least the computer science faculty, stressed a lot of like the algorithm stuff, a lot of the system design stuff to some degree, which was all very beneficial when it came to interviewing at that point. And they balanced it fairly well with solid low-level understanding. So I feel like I actually learned some useful stuff. There were some very obscure, like, what the hell am I wasting my time on this thing for? Which I think every university has. But I know that there are other schools that were close to where I went to school that they stressed like the math foundation hard. Like the first year of computer science was just straight up hardcore set theory and things like that. And it leaves you with this weird, like, cool, are you prepping me for postgrad or academia, or what is going on here? It doesn't feel like you're prepping me for work. So I think I'm not sure I would have had the self-motivation or the self-drive to have done some of the things that were very useful that just sucked, that I'm grateful for. And I'm sure I would have gotten caught up in other things that maybe were more interesting. Like we had to implement like internal implementations of a database using a B tree. I'm like, why am I doing this with myself? Like Saturday night debugging C++, null pointer exceptions. Like this sucks. What the hell? Just use SQL. But in hindsight now, it sort of makes sense. So I don't know if the non-degree path would have worked for me.
So, because I was gonna say, like, even though it preps you for the interviews and getting into a company, it's the time that you spent. Like, I guess the flip side is like, could you spend 2 years of just prepping and just going through the material and just learning what you need to do to get to the interview, versus the 4 years of, even your optional courses, you could have just like that's not going to exist. Like, oh, you need 1 credit in blah 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 that has nothing to do with comp sci, but you need X credits to actually graduate. So you took your elective in psychology, and it's like that's not probably going to help you in your interview at a company where they're like, yes, tell me about Schroeder's cat, and you're like, ah.
So it's weird. My very first job I got because I was doing psych, which was so weird. I'm like, what the hell? I did UX design, but I do wonder, like I've asked myself that exact question of, if I spent 4 years committing to doing something on my own, would I have landed up in a better place? Would I have landed
the
up?
flip side there is, could you have?
Well, that's the other thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really, really don't know. There's a lot of things where, like, I've met people who are amazing engineers who have obscure, weird backgrounds. Like, some are sort of in alignment, where you meet people who are like physicists or maths PhDs or whatever. I'm like, okay, you think a specific way and you're essentially expressing your thoughts in code in the same way you do math. That's not so far flung. But when you meet other people who are all sorts of different backgrounds and they just do incredibly well as engineers with no correlation, nothing at all, but they're just doing an amazing job. You're like, wow, how the hell is that possible? What did you get out of university that I'm not aware of? Is there something that you did that like taught you some kind of discipline that maybe some people have, some people don't, or what's happening there? But yeah, I'm not sure. It feels like there is some value to it, but at the same time, I'm not 100% convinced.
So I switched up the question, was like, who do you recommend a degree for? Because I thought you were maybe going to go down the path of, like, as you said, the discipline and motivation for yourself. Like,
Yeah.
I will admit that the university structure is a structure. And that works very well. And there is a risk, which is the monetary risk, as well as like the failure of not finishing and having to explain that to whoever, your parents or friends or whatever. And it gets you in a routine. You have classes that they follow the same schedule, and you have like weekdays, which you're going to your classes, things like that. Versus the other approaches, it's like all that burden is on yourself to make sure that you are in a routine and disciplined enough to go through. As well as, like, it brings up questions like, how do you grade your work yourself, right? Like, I guess it's like you either completed the exercise or you didn't. But you missed some of the feedback, I guess. Yeah, because I do think there is a spot for people to do it. Definitely, if that structure is something that you need, that's definitely someone I would recommend to go down getting a CS degree path. But I don't know. For me, it was very different. It started off as a hobby and just fun all the way back when I was like 9, and it just kept building. And then I wasn't even going to go into software development. I wanted to be a chef. And my grandma shot down that idea so quick. It was like, oh, wow. She's like, Corey, you will never survive in the kitchen. She's like, that work is not cut out for you. She's like, you will sit on your ass and just type. And I was like, oh, but cooking, it sounded so much more like sexy and interesting, right? So yeah, I got that gig, and then all of a sudden that turned into like a career and just kept building. I will say that I was fortunate enough to get a job early by total chance, as I had said. There wasn't even an interview. I just had networked and went to a meetup and just bumped into the right person. But once I had that, I feel like it was almost like the imposter syndrome fueled it. It wasn't a sense of like the true imposter syndrome where you really are where you're at the authority that you should be, but you feel like you aren't. It was like I actually didn't have the authority, and I was in a job that was way out of my league. But I was like, I'll figure it out and go.
Just make
and
it
like,
happen.
It wasn't like I hadn't done development, right? It wasn't like a total, like fake out and whatnot. And they hired someone who had never done development, and I just had to teach myself on the fly. It was just like never had worked really in a team, had never used any of the tooling that they had used, going into like different languages I had never touched. So I remember the amount of reading I did was ridiculous. Like, I had Amazon books coming quicker than I could even keep up with. Like, it was just absolutely crazy the amount that I think when I look back, it was something like in a span of 2 years, I spent $5,000 of books. Like it was over 100 books in 2 years that I read.
Damn.
So
you basically did a self-guided degree.
yeah.
In that content, or that amount of content would be straight up self-guided. Because that's the how do I phrase this? There's definitely a argument to be had that when you go to a college, all they're doing is some person is standing up and reading or presenting the thoughts of someone else who's written a good book and helping you with that structure. Like you said, you're up at 8 a.m., you go to class, you do this, you get this assignment done, you do the grading, you know you've done it fine, you move on. If you read the content yourself and you actually understand it and you ignore the grading and you make sure you're actually getting it, you're arguably doing a better job in getting the foundations than someone who's trying to balance writing a psych essay with a maths assignment and a computer science like chapter that they've got to read. So it's not that the content's not available to you, it's just available in a very different way. So
yeah. It's I don't know, the cheaper version of a degree, that's for sure. Like I look back on like $5,000 on books.
Yeah.
Is like half of the tuition cost that I would have paid, and I did that while working. That on top of that, right? Like I was basically it was free. It was paid because I was working at this company, and then I would go home and just read. But yeah, it's I will admit that the downside for me is not having the paper if I want to go work in the US. Like here, it is living in Canada is very easy to work in the US if you graduated with a computer science degree if it's on engineering side. So you either take computer engineering or computer science with a specialty and then covers on the engineering side. Because you go under like the TN visa here, which is like I get a job offer, I show up at the border with my diploma, and they're like, stamp, done.
Awesome.
But for me, I was like, I'm never going to do that. And if I'm ever going to work out like one of the things, it's going to be here in Canada. So at that point, I'm like, I'm pretty happy with that path.
Perfect.
So,
but,
go ahead.
I was going to say like there's a really funny thing that happens in South Africa. I'm not considered a professional because computer science is not considered an engineering nor a science faculty. So they're like, you're not a professional. My brother did engineering. My wife did psychology and graduated with honors. They're both considered professionals. The one is considered like engineering is like a proper science, and the other is like psychology is a well-respected like medical field. You're both professionals. I go to the bank and ask for a loan, and they're like, no, you're not a professional. Like, are you kidding me? Like, what the hell is your problem? But the crazy part as well is you have this, you got to where you got to by self-study, and you've got the motivation and you know how to do it. When you leave university, you've been there for, say, my case, 7 years. You leave and then you get your job and you're like, cool, I know all the things that are relevant. You find out 50% of the stuff you know has nothing to do with work at all.
Yep.
And then time goes on and then you're expected to learn something. And you're like, okay, where do I sign up for the course to do this? Like, I don't know how the hell to self-study. I didn't do that. So that is something you end up having to learn anyway, which kind of sucks. It's been an interesting journey to learn how to be able to sort of refresh your skills and learn to do it when you're coming out of a degree. So traditional studies, well, not traditional studies, fields where things don't move as quickly as computer science, you probably can do your degree and use a lot of what you've learned going forward and sort of get things going, slowly improving over time or whatever the case is. But computer science, things I did in first year, 7 years later, you like, what the hell are you even doing? Legitimately, there are things I learned how to do that would probably get me like red flagged in a PR right now. Like, that's not how we do things. You know?
Oh yeah, I definitely get that. Hiring people, and I will admit, like I see this with co-ops in university, and it's very hard to hire a first-time co-op. like a co-op who has never worked somewhere else, because they come in and what they do development in university is very different than working in a team and at a company. Like very, very, very different. Like it is a big shock. Not all, I will say some universities have gotten better integrating other things, like understanding that, like, you're going to be using Git, and here's like the basis or the very basics of using Git in a team, and you're going to use some sort of project management tooling. But I will say, like, if I went back 5 years ago, when I worked at another company and we had co-ops, a lot of them came in, they're like, I have never fucking used Git. What is this Git stuff? I was like, how did you ever work on projects with teams? They're like, we would zip up that shit and send it each other an email. And I'm like, what? like what? Like, how did you collaborate? No. John will work on classes X and Alex will work on classes Y. And like, we would just not work together. And you're like, oh God. So yeah.
There's that realization hit me hard. You get to work and they're like, you're a computer scientist, you can do code. And you're like, cool. And then they're like, okay, so you're going to check out the code like this. You're like, what's that? There's a build system. You're like, what the hell is that? There's a code review system. I don't know what that is either. And then the changes are really, really small. And you're like, no, hold on, whoa. None of this 80% of this process has ever been exposed to me. So there is a lot of it. Like, yes, it's learnable and it's company specific and all these things. But like you're saying, I know that there's that, is it CS 500, that famous like introduction course that I think Harvard does or something like that.
Oh yeah, okay. I know what you're talking about. I don't remember the actual title.
That name. There's an additional video linked to that. There was something about like the video or the information you really need or the stuff you should have or something like that, which is about like source control and PRs and just all of those things that are.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the disadvantages of the degree is you realize like the industry is rapidly evolving. So spending your 4 years in there getting your degree, so much has already changed at the end of it. Like so much. And on the other point of what you're talking about, I will say that the one thing I do find really falls short, regardless of anyone I've hired from university, is there is zero concept of like a CI/CD kind of, even a pipeline, like ever like, wait, my code needs to have this thing that tells Jenkins how to build it and run these tests against it. They will have usually a concept of like test-driven development and writing tests, but they won't have a concept of like this whole, okay, your code gets committed into a pipeline and GitLab or Jenkins or whatever is going to take over and build it and run it against like a test cluster. And every new hire I get from universities, co-op or not, I sit them down and they're like, what the fuck is this GitLab like builder stuff that I'm doing? Like what? Yep. Like what is Docker? Like where's this Docker thing going? How's it running? And I have to package what? I thought I'm writing code. It's like infrastructure as code. This is big missing part right now, if you ask me.
Huge.
But as you said, it's all teachable, and you bring someone on and you're looking at like that stuff is relatively basic. I will say when I'm hiring though, and this is probably a bias, I don't even look at the education section anymore. Like I just don't. You could have like 16 degrees and honestly I would even know, because we get in the interview and it's like, okay, let's talk about X, regardless of what your degree was or whatever it is. Like I don't care if you had a Bachelor of Arts and you came in and it has nothing to do with whatever computer science is. Like in the real world, what's this actually mean? What's your knowledge? Can you break down this problem? And I think it's changed. Obviously, we hear about this in the news, like Google's removed the requirements and things like this. But I still think people are like, oh yeah, but it gives you like a one-up, and I'm probably biased because I have no degree, so I don't put the additional weight of someone else who might when they're going through interviews and hiring. Like I don't even look at the section anymore. Like I literally just.
Okay, I don't work anywhere anymore, so no one can get pissed at me. But basically, what I used to do is this. I would look at a person's resume and I would find something on the resume that is an easy lowball question. And the reason I'm asking that is that there is no wrong answer. And I've heard that starting an interview with a person feeling confident is the best way to get the best information out of them. So I'll be like, oh, I see you did project XYZ. I could know about it. I could have absolutely no idea of what's going on. And I would ask them that. Beyond that, resume doesn't matter. As was said now, like a degree, the benefit of the field we're in being somewhat backward compared to like professionals who are like accountants or lawyers, all those things, there is no bar. The purpose of the interview is to see if you've got the skills. If you come in and we chat and I say to you, tell me about a time that you had this, cool, the culture fits, fine, we get along well enough to, and that's not you're a cookie cutter version of me, it's we can actually work together, and potentially I know I'm going to disagree with you, but that's fine. Then I ask you a question about something technical. If you learned it out of a book, if you learned it out of YouTube, or you learned it in a degree, I don't give a shit. It's just that you can do what is required of you. And even better, if I say to you, okay, I would like you to do this and this and this, and you're like, I have no idea how to do that. And I go, okay, cool, let's work through it together. That mimics a real world situation. And that there again, if you lean on the fact that you come from a school that's super prestigious or you've got some massive accreditation, none of that matters if you can't answer the questions. So from a person who's hired a number of people or interviewed a number of people and a lot of them have not had degrees, getting in the door is probably hard. Getting to the point where it's actually that person is scheduled to interview with someone is hard. But when you are there, the interviewer is not going to be phased if you can answer the questions.
I was going to say, I'm not going to go as far as saying I don't think it gets you a foot in the door or a leg up over other people. You know, I might not look at the education section, but that doesn't mean that HR during screening isn't. And that doesn't mean that other people who are, you know, software development managers aren't looking at that. So I do think like there is a leg up of having it, that there are still people who hold the weight of it. Yeah. And that might be enough to get to the interview where even if both candidates could answer the question equal, or even the person without a degree could answer the question better than the person with the degree. Mm-hmm. If the person without that degree didn't get to that point in the screening, then it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. No, exactly.
So, exactly. You know, I do think that going down the self-taught path, the biggest challenge is getting that first job. Yes. And once you can tick off that 1 year of experience somewhere, it's almost like anyone else who checks out your resume is like,
doesn't matter.
Well, they work somewhere else, so they can't be that bad.
Exactly.
I will admit that I just said it basically on the co-op stuff. I'm really hesitant when I have co-ops who have never done another term, because the first thing is like, okay, they probably aren't going to know how the other tooling works at a company. They've probably never worked in a team. The onboarding is just going to be much harder. And it's not to say they couldn't do it, but when you're facing another candidate who's on their second or third co-op term of working at another company, you're like, okay, the likelihood of that individual not having have worked with a team at 3 other companies during their university stay is pretty much no. Like they will have had to commit something to like get and done some sort of pipeline, especially because they list out where they worked at their co-op. And if you can recognize the company, you're like, oh yeah, like there's no way you worked at that company without writing blah, 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 or doing X, Y, Z. Actually, this is kind of interesting that Lola had mentioned about that moving up the management chain. I think that there's truth to this. You know, I can speak from my example or my personal experience of like, I'm at a spot where, I'm a software dev manager, and I will say that maybe not quite at a director level, but once you get past that, there are a lot of companies that are hesitant if you don't have a degree, kind of VP and C level. Most of the time it's because, especially at C level, it's no longer just one person interviewing you. It's usually the rest of the exec team is interviewing, and then the board's going to need to sign off. And just typically what I've seen is these boards are much more comfortable being able to say that that person has a piece of paper, especially if they ever want to take the company like public or something, right? It just shows that like there's no doubt that this person has the authority to talk about X. It's just one more credential on there. The other route is you have to like, on my side, it's like you have to find other paths to build up that authority, whether that's being recognized in the community with your name or doing something that's just, I don't know, tech at scale when it's, 100 million subscribers. That's right, not thousands, 100 million. Everyone. The whole world will subscribe.
Everyone. So
yeah.
What degree do you think is needed there? Is it business degrees? Is it technical degrees? Is it both?
I almost feel like anything that could be at least argued that's related. Like even the bachelor's in psychology, if you said you had like a specialty in like interaction with computers or something, or that's what your thesis was on, it's like, then I think that's enough. Like I said, it's just, you go back 10 years ago and everyone was like, oh, it's so hard to break out if you don't have that degree. I feel like the much entailed management is still somewhat like that. It hasn't fully shifted from, oh, look, there are plenty of C-levels or CTOs of companies who have no degree. And I don't think that's actually the case. Because if you look at how long it takes for people to become a C-level, like the bulk of the C-suites are people who are going to be 20 years older than me on average. And then you look at boards, they're typically a lot like older too. And I'm not saying just old people are against like not having a degree. I think you relate to like the time that you grew up and you worked. So like if you worked with everyone around you only having degrees, you're probably going to feel more comfortable with people who have degrees because you haven't necessarily worked with someone who might not have even had a degree. You might think that's bonkers. But then you just wait. And then you see like time changes, like maybe I'm just biased because I feel like, oh, I'm having difficulty getting to that level. And I'm like, therefore it must be the degree.
Must be age. Yeah.
I've seen it just in interviewing, just, even if you want to go for like, CTO at a very small startup, right? Like obviously you're not going to go for a C-level at some super large company for like the position I am. Just, when they start saying like must have managed 150 plus reports or like indirect reports, it's like, nah, sorry, haven't done that. But if you're at a much smaller company, and I have interviewed at these, typically they'll say like, listen, it's just gonna be a really hard sell to our board because you don't have like, and typically they want to even see a master's at that level. Their preference is usually actually like a PhD, because I don't know, it just carries massive weight to say like you're an expert in X related to whatever. So that's my long-winded answer.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, my retirement backup plan is go back to school, get a PhD, and teach. Like that's the plan. I can drink whiskey in the day that way and just take it easy. But no, it feels to me like there's definitely, I've never been in a situation where I've had to job hunt without a degree, but it seems like the biggest hurdle comes up at the very beginning. And then if there's growth, if there's more growth, it seems like there are blockers that are very difficult to get around unless it's your own company or whatever the case might be. But it's It's interesting because I never thought about it that perspective, but I definitely will say that getting your foot in the door, and people tend like portfolios and things like that. I'm not a front end dev, and I'm not a full stack engineer. I'm predominantly back end, where occasionally we get tasked with full stack stuff, and portfolios aren't really a big thing there. You can't. It's very difficult to be like, oh yeah, here's my 1,000 node cluster I've got running out of my warehouse that I rent on weekends. Like it doesn't work. There are cases where people who I've worked with have contributed to open source, and that's been the standout factor. But getting in the door when you have a decent university degree, and by that I mean it's related to what's happening, you got decent grades, and it's a sort of accepted university, it makes it so much easier. Like I didn't struggle at all.
I mean, I think some of that might also just be like leveraging your alumni network, right? I know all the companies I've worked at, once they get their, from the company standpoint, once they get their foot in the door at a university, they leverage that a ton, right? Yeah. They'll build out like pipelines and partnerships of like, great, every time you do like a cohort of co-op students, we will just take like 3 of them.
Yep.
So, you know, people who aren't obviously at that university aren't a part of that. They're not even going to be included. You would have to apply, and then you would have to beat that. And sometimes, like, for example, if, you know, we're looking for, like, for example, say 3 co-ops, and the university shows them like, here's 3 candidates, I might have already filled my positions. So before you could even apply, before we even post the position, they've already been filled. So, and the same thing for the alumni. Like once you've graduated, there you have access to contacts at other companies, of even being able to reach out and saying like, hey, I just want to talk to you. We both went to Carleton University. You know, could I have 5 minutes of your time? And if you think that I'd be a good candidate, could you refer me? Right? Like, so
it's, that part of it is nasty because it's unfair, in my opinion, but it's there. There's a network that exists in various ways, and the one that comes out of schooling or college is forced, and it lends itself to like, I've had a job before where a friend of mine who is a classmate, I happened to say to my boss like, hey, I'm heading out early on Friday, got a visitor coming down from out of town, we're just gonna go hang out. He's like, oh cool, what's happening? And I said like, oh, it's an ex-classmate of mine. It's like, oh cool, why don't you bring them in for lunch, and then you guys can leave after lunch. So I'm like, okay, I see what's happened. You're letting me go half day on the condition that I now bring someone in. This person wasn't even looking for a job. I'm like, hey, do you want to come chat to some of the devs? Like, yeah, okay, cool. We sit down at lunch, have this conversation ends, and I get an email like, hey, do you want to find out from them like if they're interested in working? I'm like, how is it that this person's getting a job without even looking, not even shortcuts? This is like the most friction-free path possible, just because of their network in that context. And it's purely the byproduct of the university, where it's, you guys study together, you must be able to perform at the same level. They're happy with my performance. Let's see if there's another one we can find. And that's
I think that's true regardless though of like degree or not. I think a degree is one avenue of a side door. There are many other avenues, whether you, like for me, it was like I went to a meetup and happened to bump into the CEO of the company, right? Like, oh, there was a side door there. You just happened to be at the right place at the right time. It wasn't even like I went through my network and contacted someone. It was like I was at a meetup, watching a meetup presentation, and afterwards just like talking to people, and then found that. And I think there's other scenarios too, like, you know, prior employer I had, they had a partnership with SheHacks, I think it is, and we would skip a whole stage if it got referred through that. We would skip the HR screening. We would just directly go to interviews. Like there's always other side doors. And to say that there aren't side doors, I think is total BS. Like every company, there's always things. I mean, even companies that say they have unbiased interviews,
no such thing.
I'm like, or like everyone goes through the same process. Like it's like if someone wanted to come work at my company or where I work or any of the employers, and I want to skew the results, you could just pre-prep them for whatever
Easy.
the interviews are. You know what your company's looking for. You know what the culture is going to be. You know relatively kind of what the dev tests are going to be.
Exactly.
You don't even have to actually, like, even if a different manager interviewed them and you didn't know what the test criteria was going to be, you have concept of it, what the company does, and
Exactly.
what your true cultural values are. Like, you can side door always.
My first tech interview, my first real tech interview, was a FANG job. I walked in. I was arrogant as all hell coming out of university.
Oh, sorry.
No,
I was that's what that does.
I was arrogant as all hell coming out of university. I had done my 7 years. I'd seen people drop out around me. I'd seen people, like was mentioned in chat, like showing that you don't flake. I'd done my all-nighters many times. Walked into the interview with a hangover, and I knew what the hard questions were going to be. That was it. I knew the company was small enough, or the office at that point was small enough, that I knew who my interviewers were. The one person was 2 years ahead of me at university. I knew that they were going to be math heavy, probably stats. I knew the one person had a thing for heap data structures and was going to ask questions around that. And there was a good chance that there was going to be some nasty implementation question. And the combination of just straight up blind confidence, having left the university and being like, I was better than all these people I studied with. You're not going to break me. That was arguably what got me through the interview. Because now, with all the hype and everything around FANG interviews, they're terrifying because you know what's at stake. At that point, you're like, I did 7 years. What are you possibly going to do to me in 5 hours? In those days, the Amazon interview was 8 hours long.
Yep.
Which was rough. But yeah, you come out of university with this. You have the opposite of imposter syndrome. You have this piece of paper that says you're good enough, whether you are or aren't. And also, like Chat was mentioning, degrees have no correlation to intelligence. Like, there's a lot of not very clever people who have many, many degrees. And that's, you don't know that when you just qualify. You think it means you're super smart, and off you go.
Yep.
So yeah, that's a double-edged sword as well.
Yeah, it's totally true. You know, having that degree, when you accomplish it, you're like, I'm the shit.
Exactly.
Like, I'm top notch. I had the paper to prove it.
Exactly.
And I will say that on the self-taught path, and maybe that's actually what drove me on the learning side, was working with people who were either in school or already had finished and had that. I felt like, okay, they know their shit, so I need to know my stuff. And that just reinforced the learning on my side. Like, I just need to be better. I just need, like, oh my God, like, they're so much further ahead of me. And, you know, I don't know, that's not for everyone, but for me, that definitely motivated me of, like, not having a sense of not wanting to be the smartest person in the room, but just feeling like you're not even in the same conversation as everyone. Just really got me to sit down and just go down the self-taught path. And then, like I've been alluding to, like, I think there's great merits on that side to going no degree, but it's a lot of context. Like, you know, would I have taken a degree in computer science if there was no cost for me? Probably. Probably, just because it would have bought me time. It would have been 4 years of going to school and figuring out what I really want to do and stuff at no expense. And always a fallback plan of, listen, it's just going to open up more opportunities down in the US. But for me, it was like, do I want to sit there and spend 4 years and probably $40,000 to $60,000 on something that I think I could probably get by without?
Yeah.
And you know, it ended up working out because, you know, like I said, I got lucky and right place, right time. And then I got to spend 4 years of actually doing development, and all my friends were just coming out of school saying, "Fuck, bro, I got to pay off my debt." Or some of them were fortunate enough to get co-op, like solid co-op, so then they did come out of school with no debt. But I actually felt more confident than them in those scenarios, because now I knew if I go apply anywhere else, it's not going to be an issue because I have 4 years of experience in development. And I might not have the paper that says I can do it, but that company kept me around for 4 years. And you don't need to teach me tooling. You know, I'm going to just like slot into the org. I know I'm going to know what the process is and all this
the
stuff.
political game at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Like you just know what the companies are looking for. And also it's not you actually remove a lot of the mentality of like it needs to be correct, and you realize it needs to get done. And I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that. I'm saying most businesses operate on the principle of it needs to ship and it needs to get out, because they're not there to necessarily be the correct one. Like they don't need to be the first to market. They just need to actually get it correct and ship out features enough constantly to kill competitors. Versus, you know, you could have come from a field where it's like, nah, I take my time. I know the deadlines, but I want to submit clean code. And you're like, bro, just wait until you see the code bases I work on. Clean code. Not even that I'm writing bad code. I'm just like, you're going to, at some point, you're going to inherit something that you're just like, what in the? Actually, this reminds me, we had talked about legacy code makes great devs. And I think this is actually related to the degree and no degree thing. Is if you're in school, you are, maybe some people stumble into this, but if you don't do a co-op term, you are severely hindered in not seeing just how bad code can be.
But like you need to work on a code base, which never happens in school. You never get it.
And you don't also work on projects of the size that you're going to work on in at an employer. Like you're working in your team projects of like 3 other people with you at the end of the year or whatever. And like you produce like what, 20 classes at that. And then you join your first company, you're like, yeah, it's 50,000 files. And that's one team of like 30 teams. And this, no one's touched these 5 files for 7 years. And you can't ask anyone about that. So
it's exactly that.
I was going to say, going down the no degree part, you're not necessarily going to get that either. So I guess it's more about the no degree path is going to probably get you into an employer quicker. Because let's say you spent 2 years, even 3 years, getting to the spot where you could get hired, and then you got hired, you would have 1 year over the degree of actually working. And this is ignoring co-op terms, which are really popular right now. So, and then you would have a year of just drowning in garbage code and understanding what the development world really looks like.
That first realization. I mean, so something else that's interesting is when you go the non-degree direction, you're on your own. Not so much the school, like the educator student kind of relationship, but my entire university career, the first like 4 months, I was like, oh, it's like high school. You just keep doing what you're doing. Went out for dinner with a classmate, and I said to him, like, do you even remember some of the stuff we learned about like at the beginning of class? And he was like, yes, you have to. And then it turned into like a contest between myself, him, and then later on another person. And the next 5 years were complete competition in absolutely everything we did. Every class we shared, the person who scored the lowest grade on the test had to pay for beers for the other 2. And the price of the beer wasn't the problem. It was the going to buy it and then watching the other 2 gloat at you. That was the motivator. And that probably had a performance boost like no textbook or lecturer could have provided. That idea that I was competing against these 2 other people to get the jobs, do better work, and just learn more was the biggest motivator for me. And had that not happened, my whole university experience could have been very different.
So I guess there's a middle ground. And that's for another episode of is Andre's feeling about boot camps.
Oh, good grief.
And alternative, I guess, other forms. Because we've really focused in on just degree or no degree, but there are many paths on like the no degree side of what you would like. I didn't do any boot camp, and it was just entirely self-taught. And I think really, if you go down that path, it's kind of what we're saying. It's like you need a way to keep yourself in check, whether on the motivation discipline side, but also even the competitive side pushes you, right? Like you're not going to have that if you're in isolation by yourself. It is extremely hard to want to go back and revise your code and improve it when you're in a silo with yourself. Like it's just you don't get a look at someone else. Someone else isn't able to say like, why did you do it this way? Why didn't you change it that way? I mean, it's different if you're Twitch streaming your progress and community comes in and helps you or something, or if you're in a boot camp and you know they do a lot of like pairing or review from the TA side. Okay, but they're all different ways of becoming a dev.
Yes. So. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's an interesting summary, and it makes me want to believe that the gap is getting smaller. I want to hope that it's getting less significant, and I think it's one of those things where the more non-degreed people get hired, the more non-degreed people will be involved in the interview process. Because me, 1 year out of school, interviewing someone, and they're like, I don't have a degree. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. Go away. It's totally ignorant and completely wrong. And it took me a long time to realize that. So I'm sure that there's other people with that stance as well. And you can't be shy to say, okay, we're not giving some kind of bias towards this if that's the direction you've come from. You need to have actual people with diverse backgrounds doing the interviews to make sure that some kind of diversity is happening.
I had it as will CS degrees make a comeback, but I thought it exactly on this is I think there is a middle spot of universities reshaping their programs or something not quite maybe university level, but not quite a dev boot camp, and really finding that sweet spot in there of like, okay, you've got the structure and discipline, and you learn the theory, but you come out with the practical as well. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think there's a spot for it. I think, you know, we've discussed like, okay, the degrees, like there's value on the bachelor side, depending on your context and your circumstances. There's value on the self-taught side. If you're able to keep motivated and disciplined, and if you're able to achieve basically what you would get out of 4 years, but cheaper, or trade in the work experience for the paper. But is there this sweet spot of like,
is there the common factor that you raised, and now we're overflowing into the bootcamp thing, is you took 4 years to self-learn, or a lot of time to self-learn. I went to school for a long time. Fast tracking the situation isn't necessarily possible. So people can't look for an alternative to be like, is there a different way of getting past the CS degree in a year? Probably not. It's going to be very, very, very challenging to do that.
But maybe not on the time. Like, I don't necessarily just mean like, oh, instead of 4 years, you do it in 2. Maybe it's still 4 years, but its focus is different than the current demands of getting a degree. Like, you know, and I don't know, like, obviously this, to my knowledge, something like this doesn't exist right now. I think everything else is basically like ASAP here in like, in 32 hours, we can make you into a developer.
Well, there's weird things there. Like, I had to implement the actual data structures as part of my data structure course. Not like, here is a hash map. It's like, write the hash map, understand what it does, tell me what's going on inside of it. If I was paying a huge amount of money for a 2-year degree, and they were like, hey, this is what I want you to do. Like, piss off, this doesn't make sense. You're wasting my time. Tell me how to make a web app, and then I can make the next Facebook. But that's not what happens. Like there's a ton of useless information that exists that is partially because I'm interested in it, partially because it came with the syllabus, but it has no benefit. The only benefit I can think of is if you've had a bad interview and you can somehow slide it in as a piece of like, oh, by the way, but I know this. But beyond that, yeah.
Yeah. That's very. I had a point I was going to make in that I just slipped on
I
it.
ranted.
No, it was. I was also laughing so hard because it was so true. Like nobody cares about knowing about hash map. They're just like, listen, I just need to, like, I need the secrets to make 6-figure salary like ASAP. Like, oh, there, I remember. I will say that on the flip side, I probably put extra weight on people who do come out of boot camps during interviews. And it's probably because of the fact that, okay, have you just ironed out and memorized the minimum to get through this interview, and you've only got like the questions correct to just what I'm going to ask for, and then when we actually sit you down, it's a total fucking disaster when you're sitting in front of like an actual development project or a real task that comes along your way. And yeah, I will say like that is one value to the degree is I haven't had a spot where I sat someone down and they're not able to actually accomplish the work. There are definitely times where it might be the approach is like, oh, here, we couldn't use the, like, I want to rip out all the code because, you know, it's, I don't know, some terrible optimization. And if we just rewrote it entirely and did it this way, we could use this structure. And you're like, okay, great. Like in school, we could do that, but you're about to change like 40 classes on 3 different teams and you're going to break like 200 tests, and that's just not going to happen. But regardless of that, if I just tell them like, no, like we're writing in the shitty way because of the existing legacy that we've inherited, or whatever. We're bound to that because the other team's not going to change that, or won't because they have other things that rely on that. I've never had people through all the hiring I've done not actually be able to produce the work.
Wow. So
on the degree side. Sorry.
The point you made about the expectations, like the people who are least likely to impress me in an interview are ones who have just finished their degree, are hyper confident, and are unable to answer the theoretical algorithm questions. Because that is what I expect to be the freshest on your mind. If you've got 5 years experience and I ask you what the benefit is of a sorting algorithm X versus Y, and you can't tell me, fine. If you're fresh out of college and you're like, oh yes, I just finished my algorithms course, and I'm like, okay, cool, can you tell me what the benefit is of this sorting algorithm over that? And they can't tell me, there's a problem. Because if you can't consume and ingest the information you've just read, then you're probably not doing a great job at what you're meant to be doing. I mean, the early hire interviews where people come out of college and they get asked questions like, tell me about a time you've worked in a team where you didn't get along with people. What value are you getting from that? It's a college environment. Yes, you were pegged with 4 people. You got told this is what you had to do. You didn't have an agreement because everyone wanted to get the higher grade. It's a generic answer. But yes, there's different context, and I think that has to be appreciated as well with the interview process. But anyway.
I was going to just share this. This is what I found recently, by the way. I just worked out. I just found this today on something I was watching, and it worked out perfect to kind of what you're saying is, it actually, I think there are some students who are able to, like, look here's the exam questions for, well, this is 2014 for, I don't know what I clicked on. Carleton University Principles of Manufacturing. And I feel like there's a way of hacking degrees now. So you do the very minimal that you need to actually say you finish the course without actually retaining or understanding the information. And for those who haven't gone to university at all, what you find out is most of your profs cycle through like 3 to 5 year of exams. So if you can get 3 to 5 years of exams, you actually will have all questions and all answers for those exams. But this even included like midterms and lab reports, and there was one that had like even the assignments and stuff, and then you could look through the prior years and you're like, oh, this class actually has the same assignment every year, and there's people who've uploaded their answers with it too. So you're like, obviously you could get caught, but it just goes to say kind of like someone who goes to the class and doesn't retain any of the information but passed it, you're like, well,
it's exactly that. There's hacks. There's hacks all over the place that can make you stand out more, get you to where you need to get to.
And sometimes I'm like, I don't know, like sometimes I say that's a good thing, and sometimes that's a bad thing. Like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be like, kudos to the person who tells me like, listen, I was able to get my degree like without putting the full amount of effort in it. Like, a piece of me wants to be like, fuck, you're efficient. Another piece of me is like, but
yeah, there's optimization and like cutting corners and those sorts of things that just seem to work for some people. I know, guys, I say this, I know a person who cannot code, and they left university with a computer science degree. They structured every single one of their group assignments to be the person doing the documentation, to be the person who's doing all the auxiliary tasks that no one wants to do. And they were structuring as if, oh no, I know how to code, it's fine, I'll just do the rest of the stuff. They probably couldn't do FizzBuzz if they were put on the spot.
Anyways,
so, yes,
that's a good spot to end it. Listen, everyone, if you have a degree and you can't do FizzBuzz, there's a problem. If you don't have a degree and you can't do FizzBuzz, there's still a problem. Everyone should be able to do FizzBuzz, developer or not. We're going to have to make the FizzBuzz for children book, because that's the new thing, like all the programming for children books. Well, we're going to do the FizzBuzz one, and Kickstarter is coming to you soon. Until next week, I guess is a good spot to end. So,
everyone.
Adios, everyone.